They're just a fancy version of F equals ma applied to fluids, and each direction of motion has one equation, meaning there are three in total. Notice in our building of the equation, we made one major assumption, that flow was incompressible. Today, we learn all about the assumptions you make in fluid mechanics to simplify the equations and make them more approachable. Even though the conservation equations are rooted in basic physical ideas, the equations themselves are pretty intense. Lots of derivatives, some of them second order, and multiple variables in each equation. These make up 4 equations total. Equations themselves are pretty intense. Lots of derivatives, some of them second order, and multiple variables in each equation. These make up 4 equations total, 1 for conservation of mass and 3 for conservation of momentum, and there are technically 4 unknowns that we can solve for, specifically the velocity field, u, v, and w, and the pressure. You may find yourself confused and wondering, how the heck do you solve these things? And you'd be in pretty good company, because it's something that stumps scientists even today. These equations are famous for their complexity, and solving them has become one of the well-known millennium problems. To solve them in their entirety, we generally need computers. But if we want to do basic solutions on pen and paper, we need to make some assumptions. Making them is solve the velocity field, u, v, and w, and the pressure. Specifically the velocity field, u, v, and w, and the pressure. You may find yourself confused and wondering, how the heck do you solving them has become one of the well-known millennium problems. To solve them in their entirety, we generally need computers. But if we want to do basic solutions on pen and paper, we need to make some assumptions. Making assumptions on paper has become one of the well-known computers. But if we want to do basic solutions on pen and paper, we generally need computers. Problems. To solve them in their entirety, we generally need computers. But if we want to do basic solutions on pen and paper, we need to make some assumptions. Making assumptions removes terms in the equations that make them easier to solve overall. Let's jump right into the major assumptions, talk about what terms they impact, and when you can make them. First, there is the incompressible assumption, something you've seen in our conservation equation building already. Physically, this means that the density is a constant and the fluid cannot be compressed. Functionally, this means that derivatives with only rho in it go to zero, and rho can generally pop out of the derivatives that have other variables. To make this assumption, you are generally working with liquids, which are safe to assume incompressible. If you're working with slow-moving gases, which means the velocities in your flow field are much lower than the speed of sound for that fluid, you're also good to use it. Next, we have the two-dimensional good to use it. Next, we have the two-dimensional assumption. Physically, this assumption means the flow changes only in two directions, and functionally that means derivatives with respect to that third dimension are inherently zero. It's very common that the third dimension is z, so usually it's safe to assume unless told otherwise. Paired with the 2D assumption is the two-component assumption, or 2c. Physically, this means flow only has two velocity components, and the velocity in that third dimension is zero. You can make the 2D and 2C assumptions when you have channels or sometimes boundary layers, generally flows that are very wide in one dimension compared to the others. You also generally need laminar flow to make this assumption, which we'll learn about more when we talk about turbulence. The next major common assumption is about more when we talk about turbulence. The next major common assumption is the steady assumption. Steady, in the context of fluids, means unchanging in time, so we can set the time derivatives to zero. This is a super common one and occurs whenever you have a flow that boundary conditions or the forcing are not changing in time. For example, if you have a pump driving a pipe flow with a constant pressure, the flow generally will not change no matter what time you look at it. With a constant pressure, the flow generally if you have a pump driving a pipe flow with a constant pressure, the flow generally will not change no matter what time you look at it. You could walk away for an hour or maybe even a day and come back and it would be doing the same thing. Conversely, we have the fully developed assumption for when even a day and come back and it would be doing the same thing. Conversely, we have the fully developed assumption for when things don't vary in space. Most commonly, this means Conversely, you could walk away for an hour or maybe even a day and come back and it would be doing the same thing. Conversely, we have the fully developed assumption for when things don't vary in space. Most commonly, this means flow is not changing in the x direction, which is the Most commonly, this means assumption for when things don't vary in space. Most commonly, this means flow is not changing in the x direction, which is the streamwise direction typically. This assumption only applies to the velocity field, so derivatives of velocity with this assumption only applies to the velocity field, so derivatives of velocity with respect to x are zero. It is possible with the fully developed assumption to have a pressure that changes in time. It's quite common for pressure-driven flow, where there is a pressure gradient dp dx, but the flow itself is fully developed and not changing in the x direction. This happens in enclosed flows specifically, like pipes and channels. Enclosing the flow limits the flow's ability to grow, which drives it to become developed and balanced in the streamwise direction. Also, generally you need flow to be laminar to be instantaneously fully developed. The next major assumptions deal with the forces that act on the fluid. The first one is that flow is inviscid. Physically, inviscid means that the viscosity forces are not important or low relative to other forces in the problem. Functionally, this means assuming viscosity goes to zero. This assumption must be applied carefully because viscosity is quite important in lots of problems even though it might not seem like it. Generally, you make this assumption when you have a high momentum flow, which means it can have a high velocity or be very large. When we discuss non-dimensional numbers in another video, we will discuss the Reynolds number which applies here. Also, you need to be far away from a boundary. Boundaries are where boundary layers occur, which is caused by viscosity. In aerodynamics, we use this assumption in cases called potential flow, where much of the lift and drag on bodies can be calculated making the inviscid assumption. Next, we have the no body forces assumption, which is fairly self-explanatory. In these cases, all the body forces are negligible and set to zero. It's quite common and occurs in most flows. Notably, you can't make this assumption when you have density gradients, multiple fluids in your flow, multiple phases in your flow like liquids and gas, multiple phases in your flow like liquids and gases of the same fluid, liquid surfaces like on top of the ocean, and there are many more. And finally, a common assumption that is made at the outset of fluids analysis is that you are working with a Newtonian fluid. Physically, this means that the fluid viscosity is constant and doesn't depend on the stress it's feeling. It's called Newtonian because Newton's law of viscosity defines this constant behavior. When you have a fluid that breaks this assumption, it's called a non-Newtonian fluid. Notable non-Newtonian fluids are ketchup, blood, shampoo, soaps, and many others. Lucky for us, and humans in general, air and water are both safely Newtonian. In our derivations, we have essentially already assumed Newtonian fluids because we've used Newton's law of viscosity without realizing it in our conservation of momentum building. All of these make up the major assumptions that you will commonly see in fluid mechanics. In practice, you will use them all the time, and often you need them to be able to solve problems. You will find yourself searching for which assumptions apply to your problem to be able to help you out. Consider the full x direction conservation of momentum equation in its entirety. Now, let's make a series of common assumptions. First, we assume steady, so we can get rid of the time derivative. Second, we assume incompressible, which is an assumption that we already made in the derivation that allows density to go out front. Fully developed lets us cross out some ddx terms of velocity. 2D, 2C assumptions let us get rid of z derivatives and the w velocity. Last, we assume no body forces and chop off that last term. This leaves us with a much more approachable and solvable function that still accurately describes some fluid flows. You will often be relieved at how simple an assumption can make your problem. And that's it. Let's review. And that's it. Let's review. Today, we introduce the major assumptions in fluid mechanics that are necessary in solving the conservation of mass and momentum equations to get to know the unknowns of velocity and pressure. Incompressible means density is constant, and it's for liquids and slow gases. Two-dimensional and two-component means nothing changes in z, and there is no w velocity, common for channels and boundary layers. Steady means no change in time of any quantity, which happens when your boundary conditions and forcing are constant. Fully developed says the velocity doesn't change in x, most seen in closed flows like pipes and channels. The inviscid assumption means you can ignore viscosity completely, and the Newtonian assumption means viscosity is constant. Lastly, there are no body forces in the problem. You can easily set them to 0. In practice, you will regularly make use of all these assumptions. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. Hi, and welcome to the next lecture in fluid mechanics. Last time, we finished our exploration of the conservation equations by exploring the common assumptions in fluid mechanics. Without assumptions,
एकदमै सजिलो काटियो त्यसरी अनि रिजल्टलाई राम्रो देखाउन खोजियो त्यसरी शिक्षा सुधार हुने होइन हैन केपी शर्मा ओलीज्यूले अहिले ठुलो ठुलो भाषण दिइराख्नु भएको छ मैले यस्तो गरे थिए र यति सुधार आयो भन्नुहुन्छ तर ग्राउन्ड रियालिटी के छ भन्दाखेरि क्वेशन पेपर अति सजिलो काटेको थियो त्यही भएर यति धेरै स्टुडेन्ट पास भएको कारण चाहिँ त्यो क्वेशन पेपर सजिलो काटेर स्टुडेन्टलाई पास गराएर राम्रो हुने हैन शिक्षालाई
think my outfit is offensive?
Are you Mexican?
No.
Yes.
I think it reaffirms stereotypes that are offensive to people.
It's not yours.
Do you find my outfit offensive?
Yes.
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's not your culture?
You don't really understand what their culture means and what it means to wear these things, like the hats and the maracas. You sort of have to understand where all of this comes from for it to not be cultural appropriation.
Does my outfit offend you?
You look, no. You look nice.
Thank you. Do you like my costume?
Yes.
Does it offend you?
No.
Do you like my outfit?
Oh yeah, it's awesome.
Does my outfit offend you?
No, not at all.
No, nothing. That's good.
The equations are incredibly difficult to solve directly. Luckily, there are plenty of... Hi, and welcome to the next lecture in fluid mechanics. Last time, we finished our exploration of the conservation equations by exploring the common assumptions in fluid mechanics. Without assumptions, the equations are incredibly difficult to solve directly. Luckily, there are plenty of common assumptions that apply to real-life flow situations. Today, we pivot and start to consider dimensionality. Fluids analysis is rooted in finding non-dimensional numbers and exploring quantities. Today, we pivot and start to consider dimensionality. Fluids analysis is rooted in finding non-dimensional numbers and exploring quantities relative to others. We consider the power of dimensions, specifically the rule of dimensional homogeneity, and how it allows us to solve problems in engineering with little to no physics knowledge. Our focus in this video is dimensional homogeneity, and it starts our exploration of thinking about units and dimensions. But before we explore this rule of dimensional homogeneity, let's get familiar with the common dimensions in fluid mechanics. Most properties in fluids are made up of three base dimensions. Mass, length, and time. When expressing the dimensions of a quantity, I tend to put it in brackets for clarity. Mass has the symbol m, length has the symbol L, and time has the symbol T. Note here I use dimensions to refer to the abstract mass, length, and time, whereas units are more specific, like kilogram, meter, and seconds. There are a number of widely used parameters in fluid mechanics. Let's summarize them. their common symbols, and their base dimensions. This list of common parameters includes area, volume, mass, density, pressure, force, and dynamic viscosity. And finally, while I never use it in my videos, the kinematic viscosity is also quite common in fluid mechanics, which is really just the dynamic viscosity normalized by density. I prefer not to complicate things and stick with just dynamic viscosity. Fluid mechanics, which is really just the dynamic viscosity normalized by density. I prefer not to complicate things and stick with just dynamic viscosity. This is an important chart to remember, and working with fluids for any period of time, you will inherently memorize the dimensions that each parameter has. Knowing the dimensions of the quantity you're looking for can be very helpful in trying to figure out answers in analysis. You can use dimensional homogeneity to do sim analysis. You can use dimensional homogeneity to do simple yet effective analysis with just the dimensions of the problem. The rule states that in an equation, all terms must have the same units. This isn't just a rule in fluid mechanics, it's a basic rule of science and arithmetic. To show how obvious it is, consider what your answer would be if you were asked to add 10 hours to 1 kilometer. You can't really answer it because it doesn't make any sense. When you add two quantities together to get a third quantity, all those quantities have the same dimension, whether it's hours, kilometers, or kilograms. Let's consider generalizing dimensional homogeneity. To ensure that the three base dimensions are consistent throughout an equation, the exponents of each base dimension must be equal on both sides of the equation. If m, l, and t have the exponents of a, b, and c on the left side, and d, e, and f on the right, then a equals d, b equals e, and c equals f. This ensures that there are the same dimensions on the left-hand side and right-hand side of the equation. We can try and apply this generalized rule to a few real-life examples to see how powerful it really is. I have two daughters. In the summer when it's hot, sometimes they like to play with the hose. Now, my oldest daughter can be a bit mischievous and likes to obliterate my youngest daughter with the hose. One day, I got to thinking, is there any way I can take the things that I know, like the hose geometry, things that I can measure, like the hose velocity, and guess the force my youngest daughter feels when being blasted with the hose? And to make things interesting, I'm not allowed to use any physics knowledge. No flow rate stuff or F equals ma. The first thing you do with any problem is you gather what you think will be meaningful parameters. First, we have the hose diameter, some average flow velocity, and what we're after is the force exerted on my daughter by the hose. Now, we compare the base dimensions of what we want to solve for, the force, to the other parameters in the problem, like diameter and velocity. And in writing these down, you might notice that we've immediately hit a snag. Force has mass in it as its base dimension, but our two parameters so far only have length and time. This means, no matter what we do, we can't make diameter and velocity give us a force. We need something with mass in it. At this point, you can start to consider basic fluid properties. When you're searching for mass, the fluid density is usually the parameter you need. Let's include fluid density in our analysis. And it makes sense because the denser a fluid is, the higher the force it can exert. Our goal here is to find a functional relationship between the force and some or multiple combination of these parameters. And the most basic way to do this without already knowing the answer is to guess and check all the different combinations. Let's start simple and then add complexity in our guesses. First, we start with the simplest combination of parameters that give us mass, length, and time. This combination is some product of just velocity and density. So, we set it up with generalized exponents. Here, f equals u to the a and rho to the b, where we are solving for a and b. With this type of analysis, there is always an unknown unit-free constant out front. This is the best we'll be able to do with dimensional analysis. We won't be able to solve for the constant, but we will know how force behaves with the base. Each base unit is in this the mass combination. The only other combination of parameters that have the combined base dimensions of force are diameter, velocity, and density. Mass tells us that c equals 1, the time tells us that b equals 2. And finally, the length lets us solve for a, which equals 2. Equations are set that make the units of force. Our analysis, completely lacking any physics knowledge, says that the force goes as diameter squared, velocity squared, and linearly with density. Out front, we have an unknown unitless constant. Let's compare this to reality, which is based in physics into rho UA. And the area of a circle, which is the exit of the hose, it looks when wind tunnels have a contraction, typically. It works when we U. Most properties and fluids effective. It's a base these together. Dimensions are left-hand side and right-hand side. Hi, and welcome to the next lecture.
मैले राखेको हो त्यो सिङको जुन कपाल थियो
फोरै होइन त्यो
त्यहाँ कपाल छ त्यो भित्र मैले त्यो
त्यसैमा सबै
lecture in fluid mechanics. Last time, we started to consider the dimensions of problems. These base dimensions are mass, length, and time, and almost all fluid parameters are combinations of these dimensions. We found by following the rule of dimensional homogeneity that we could solve complicated flow problems without knowing physics, by just making sure that dimensions are consistent. Today, we're going to explore non-dimensional numbers. One of my favorite aspects of fluid mechanics is that almost all analysis by nature has tons of non-dimensionalization, thinking about quantities relative to other quantities in the problem. We'll introduce some common non-dimensional numbers that you'll see throughout fluid mechanics and where they come from. Let's jump in. Non-dimensional numbers are numbers that are generated when you normalize a quantity by some other relevant quantity with the same dimensions.